Some live pictures from the United Nations where the Secretary General is about to give a news conference, his first news conference, if he takes questions, of course, since the October 7th attacks. Let's listen in.
Humanitarian crisis. It is a crisis of humanity. The intensifying conflict is shaking the world, rattling the region, and most tragically, destroying so many innocent lives. Ground operations by the Israel Defense Forces and continued bombardment are hitting civilians, hospitals, refugee camps, mosques, church, and UN facilities, including shelters. No one is safe. At the same time, Hamas and other militants use civilians as human shields and continue to launch rockets indiscriminately towards Israel. I reiterate my utter condemnation of the abhorrent acts of terror perpetrated by Hamas on 7 October and repeat my call for the immediate, unconditional and safe release of hostages held in Gaza. Nothing can justify the deliberate torture, killing, injuring and kidnapping of civilians. The protection of civilians must be paramount. I'm deeply concerned about clear violations of international humanitarian law that we are witnessing. Let me be clear, no party to an armed conflict is above international humanitarian law. Ladies and gentlemen of the press, Gaza is becoming a graveyard for children. Hundreds of girls and boys are reportedly being killed or injured every day. More journalists have reportedly been killed over a 4-week period than in any conflict in at least 3 decades. More United Nations aid workers have been killed than in any comparable period in the history of our organization. I salute all those who continue their life-saving work despite the overwhelming challenges and risks. And the unfolding catastrophe makes the need for a humanitarian ceasefire more urgent with every passing hour. The parties to the conflict, and indeed the international community, face an immediate and fundamental responsibility to stop the inhuman collective suffering and dramatically expand humanitarian aid to Gaza. Today, the United Nations and our partners are launching a $1.2 billion humanitarian appeal to help 2.7 million people. That's the entire population of the Gaza Strip and 500,000 Palestinians in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Some life-saving aid is getting into Gaza from Egypt through the Rafah crossing. But the trickle of assistance does not meet the ocean of need. And let's be clear, the Rafah crossing alone does not have the capacity to process 8 trucks at the scale required. Just over 400 trucks have crossed into Gaza over the past 2 weeks, compared with 500 a day before the conflict. And crucially, this does not include fuel. Without fuel, newborn babies in incubators and patients on life support will die. Water cannot be pumped or purified. Raw sewage could soon start gushing onto the streets, further spreading disease. Trucks loaded with critical relief will be stranded. The way forward is clear. A humanitarian ceasefire now. All parties respecting all their obligations under international humanitarian law now. This means the unconditional release of the hostages in Gaza now. The protection of civilians, hospitals, UN facilities, shelters and schools now. More food, more water, more medicine, and of course fuel entering Gaza safely, swiftly, and at the scale needed now. Unfettered access to deliver supplies to all people in need in Gaza now. And the end of the use of civilians as human shields now. None of these appeals should be conditional on the others. And for all of these, we need more funding now. In addition, I remain gravely concerned about rising violence and an expansion of the conflict. The occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, is at a boiling point. Let us also not forget the importance of addressing the risks of the conflict spilling over to the wider region. We are already witnessing a spiral of escalation from Lebanon and Syria to Iraq and Yemen. That escalation must stop. Cool heads and diplomatic efforts must prevail. Hateful rhetoric and provocative actions must cease. I am deeply troubled by the rise in anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim bigotry. Jewish and Muslim communities in many parts of the world are on high alert, fearing for their personal safety and security. Emotions are at a fever pitch. Tensions are running high, and the images of suffering are heartbreaking and soul-crushing. But we must find a way to hold on to our common humanity. I think of civilians in Gaza, the vast majority women and children, terrified by the relentless bombardment. I joined the UN family in mourning 89 of our UNRWA colleagues who have been killed in Gaza, many of them together with members of their family. They include teachers, school principals, doctors, engineers, guards, support staff, and a young woman named Mai. Mai did not let her muscular dystrophy or her wheelchair confine her dreams. She was a top student, became a software developer, and devoted her skills to working on information technology for UNRWA. I am so deeply inspired by her example. And I think of all those tortured and killed in Israel nearly 1 month ago, and the hostages abducted from their homes, their families, their friends, while simply living their lives. 10 days ago, I met with some of the family members of those hostages. I heard their stories, felt their anguish, and was deeply moved by their compassion. I will never relent in working for their immediate release. This is essential in itself and central to solving many other challenges. One mother movingly shared with me her desolation over her abducted son, Ersh. She also spoke outside the Security Council, and on the subject of confronting hatred, she said, and I quote, "When you only get outraged when one side's babies are killed, then your moral compass is broken and your humanity is broken," end quote. Even in her utter despair, she stood before the world and reminded us, and I quote, "In a competition of pain, there is never a winner," end quote. We must act now to find a way out of this brutal, awful, agonizing dead end of destruction, to help end the pain and suffering, to help heal the broken, and to help pave the way to peace, to a two-state solution with Israelis and Palestinians living in peace and security. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir.
All right, the United Nations Secretary General speaking in New York to reporters there. We were hoping that he would take questions from the reporters there, but he hasn't. It's his spokesman who will be doing that a little later, I think, Stefan Dujarric at the podium. Antonio Guterres speaking to reporters for the first time since the October the 7th attack by Hamas on Israel. And his statement there coming on the day that the death toll of Palestinians killed in the Israeli attacks on Gaza reached the grim milestone of 10,000. A statement also coming as Israel's bombing campaign, as you can see on those live pictures from Gaza, are continuing. Intense bombing of Gaza City in the last few minutes as the United Nations Secretary General was making that statement. It was a pretty strong statement. The language used by Antonio Guterres, very strong. He said Gaza is becoming a graveyard for Palestinian children, hundreds of girls and boys reportedly being killed or injured every day. He announced also that the United Nations and its partners are launching a $1.2 billion humanitarian appeal to help the 2.7 million people in Gaza. And also 500,000 Palestinians in the occupied West Bank and occupied East Jerusalem. A number of things that the United Nations Secretary General talked about there, which we're going to discuss now with our diplomatic editor, James Space, who's here on the set with us. As I said, James, a pretty strong statement from the United Nations Secretary General coming on what is an important day today with this 10,000 death toll in Gaza of Palestinians killed in Israeli airstrikes. What did you make of what he had to say, and what stood out the most for you?
A crisis of humanity was one of his first words, and he was very, very clear who was responsible, saying that it was the ground operations of the Israeli Defense Force and the continued bombardment that are hitting civilians, hospitals, refugee camps, mosques, churches and UN facilities. It is interesting, though, that this speech was very balanced. There was quite a lot about what happened on October the 7th. Remember the criticism he got when he spoke
at the Security Council from the Israelis, right?
From the Israeli ambassador calling for his resignation. That's because he said what happened on October the 7th didn't happen in a vacuum, and there was a context to it. Got a great deal of criticism, and interesting that there was nothing really about the historical context in this speech. And he has to be very measured and has to remember that he has an Israeli audience as well, because he is the man in his job as the Secretary General of the United Nations who might have to try and negotiate at some sort of peace. Right. That puts him in a difficult position when you also hear him saying that he mourns 88 UN colleagues who've been killed in Gaza, because he's their employer. He has a duty of care. If you were the employer of 88 people who were killed, you'd want to start raging at the person responsible for killing them, which of course is Israel.
Right. A strong but measured speech, as you said. He also talked about aid, which is crucial right now for Gaza. He said some life-saving aid is getting into Gaza from Egypt through the Rafah crossing. It's not enough, he said. He says the Rafah crossing alone does not have the capacity to process aid trucks at the scale required. So there is another crossing, of course, that he's alluding to here. Are we likely to see any progress on more aid getting into Gaza, not just through Rafah, but through the other crossing?
Yeah, it's a hint, but it's not one I've heard him make publicly before, that Israel should open up Kerem Shalom. I'm sure privately they've been saying that to the Israelis all the way through this. Kerem Shalom is a much bigger deal. It is where most of the trucks used to go in from Israel directly into Gaza, and it's been completely closed since October the 7th, saying that Rafah alone doesn't have the capacity. There is no other crossing from Egypt, so you'd have to have a crossing from Israel. It seems that he's talking about that publicly. The other thing he's talking about on aid publicly is about fuel. Of course, that's the one thing, even though some trucks have gone in, nowhere near enough, according to the Secretary General, just over 400 trucks. No fuel has gone in, and he made it clear that that means newborn babies and people on life support care, people on dialysis, they're going to die.
Briefly, James, there's a Security Council meeting later, a closed-door Security Council meeting. What can we expect from that?
Well, I think there'll be more discussion of the current situation and more disagreement and impasse in the Security Council. I think they'll be hoping that a closed-door meeting of the Security Council will also perhaps give some impetus to negotiations, because remember, the Security Council hasn't been able to pass a resolution in over a month on this particular issue. The argument at the moment is, if you have a resolution, does it have the word ceasefire in it, or does it have the word humanitarian pause? You've got currently both the US and Russia prepared to use their veto over those words.
I'll pause you there. James Space, our diplomatic editor, thank you very much.